Okay, this is part 3, assessment. Now, we have to ask ourselves, why do we look at assessment when we are talking about um, multicultural differences? Well, as with all kids, we want to evaluate general academic performance. We also need to know whether or not a student is learning the skills that we say that they're being taught. And in order to do that, whenever when we're doing an IQ, now all of this you have to remember, we only do this when we suspect that there may be an exceptionality of one type or another. Now remember, an exceptionality could be any one of the 13 disabilities or an area in giftedness. The whole point of an exceptionality is that it goes beyond a basic disability. It's when a disability impacts school performance to the point that there is a significant difference in what the student needs. So, we have to decide whether or not they have a disability or an exceptionality that affects school performance. So, we have to start off with looking at pre-referrals. Now, the pre-referral stage basically says that we have some concerns about the student's performance in school. We need to figure out what exactly the problem is. Now, if there is indeed a problem, then we have to go to the pre-referral stage. Now, we've already done a few interventions by this time, but this is where we specifically do interventions. Now, I will mention right here, anytime that you've done interventions, anything to help students, write it down. If you didn't write it down, you didn't do it. That's how the law looks at it, even if you did do it. You may have to start over again if you haven't been writing everything down. So, anytime you do an intervention, you write everything down. You don't have to write an essay. Just write the name of the intervention that you did, the date, and the student's response to it. Did it help them? If so, how much did it help them? Um, and don't give up on your intervention. Sometimes it takes a little while for them to work. We also have to look at non-discriminatory testing. When we look at what the IDEA says, it is very, very clear, the law is very clear about making sure that we are participating in non-discriminatory testing. Now, this goes back to the 94-142. This was an original premise of special education law, because we already knew by 1975 that there were times when people would use testing in order to separate students out. We know this because we can go back and look at what happened when Brown was given a decision in 1954. When Brown v. BOE overturned the segregation system that we had in this country, then we had to deal with the idea that all children would be educated together. This is a basic premise that we have been operating on for the last 60 years. And so we need to be very, very careful, 60, almost 70 years. We need to be very careful about how we deal with non-discriminatory issues. So, according to the law, what happened was that, okay, we have to have these kids in our classes, so we'll test them. And then we'll put them into intellectual disability or mental retardation classes. So a lot of these kids were sidelined. And they weren't just sidelined, they were put in a separate section of the school. So in essence, we were still segregating. Um, and we had a lot of kids that the only time that they had any issues in school were in school. Outside of school, they were complete functioning members of their community. So then we also want to think about multiple intelligences. Not all kids are good at academics. We need to find out what they're good at. We also need to use a variety of assessment measures because we want to make sure that we're doing the right thing. Now, remember when I talked about overrepresentation and misidentification? So we have over and under representation based on the area that we're looking at, but we also have to make sure that we are not misidentifying anybody. So how do we misidentify a student? Bias, our own negative attitudes. We have to be very careful about what our attitudes are and why we are sending that child to a referral. Then, our inconsistency of educational programs. So, program hopping from one reading program to another, this is what we're talking about. Poor schools down at the bottom, and then our own unresponsiveness to, or not understanding how there's a difference between language and culture and how that impacts school. So when we decide that language and culture should not impact how a student learns, then we are really contributing to this overrepresentation or misidentification of students. Then we have to look at the language disorder or language difference. Is it a language barrier or is it a language impairment? And that's the real question. So we have to make sure that when we look at a student, that we're looking at language, we're looking at whether or not they actually have a language impairment or whether or not they just don't understand the language. That can make a child look like they have an impairment, but not really. So the basic guideline is if a student has an impairment, it's going to occur in both English and their dominant language. So here we have a little graph, and so what we're looking at is special education by enrollment. Okay? Now, we want to look at, now the triangles are African American, squares are Hispanic, X's are the white population, and the little circles down here, this is the Asian population. And this is basically how so we have white students as percent of the district, and then we have our percent of ethnic groups enrolled in special education, and then basic education, okay? So we've got, this is our percent of ethnic groups enrolled in special education, and we have white students as our percent of the district, okay? So it's kind of a convoluted graph here, but I really like it because what it shows us is, okay, this is our percentage of African Americans in special education. Not in education altogether, but in special education. Now, we're looking here at, the differences between how often a student who is African American and the student who is Hispanic is referred and placed into special education. Big difference. 5% may not seem like a whole lot, but when you look across the country and think about how many kids we actually have in our schools, 5% is a lot. Now, the Hispanic population tends to mirror the white population to a certain extent, okay? And so, you know, there's there are some differences, but not as big as we would expect with some other areas. Now down here with the Asian population tends to not refer their student or allows parents to place their child into special education unless it is for gifted education. They're more than willing to talk to us about that, but anything else, they pretty much want to handle it in-house. So, when we think about evaluation, assessment, accountability, we also have to remember that according to all of our education laws, that those laws require that all students participate in statewide and district assessments. But they do give us a little bit of leeway with students who have lived in the U.S. for less than 1 year. If they are non-native speakers, rather, they don't speak English, and they've lived in the United States for less than a year, then they may participate in an alternative assessment one time. After that, they're tested with their grade group. So, if we have a student who comes in from Mexico, they have a third grade education in Mexico, but they didn't attend school after that. Happens a lot, more than you might think. But they're in 8th grade. The second year, they are tested with their grade group, not with the grade that they actually have experienced with. So, what can we do about it? We need to place pressure on schools to teach English faster. Now, I know the schools are already stressed enough as it is, but we have to teach English faster to students. We also have to help the districts at central office understand ELL needs so that they can give the schools more funding to deal with the problems that particular schools have. We have to address learning problems early because we have to remember they're not just dealing with the learning problem. They're also dealing with a language barrier. And you put those two things together and it's pretty difficult. Now, on top of that, they're also dealing with culture assimilation. So they're dealing with a lot of difficulties that we may not always understand. And we need to place higher expectations on our students. We should not assume that they can't do the work. We should assume that we need to help them find a way to do the work.